Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today I'm flying at you with another Skies of Ace Combat video. But today I'm not going to be talking about the plane, but I am going to be doing some F-22 Raptor gameplay. And the reason this is because recently, while I was doing various research on all the various aircraft I featured, there was a conversation that really got my attention on a forum. I'm not sure, don't remember the name of the forum. It might have been Reddit. This was actually a while ago at this point that I saw the conversation, and I didn't really follow up with it because I've actually had this debate before. The F-22 Raptor, does it need a gun? Well, I feel it actually does need a gun. Changed my mind. And like I said, I've gotten in this debate before. I've actually gotten in this debate multiple times on, does planes like the F-22 and the F-35 really need a 20mm Vulcan? And generally, in general terms, the F-22 was, like I said, the primary focus of the forum conversation. And a lot of people were saying no, the F-22, because it is a 5th generation stealth fighter, it doesn't need an M61 Vulcan gun. It doesn't need a gun at all. And some people were swayed by the fact that, hey, the F-35 Fat Amy here does not have a gun, which is incorrect, actually. Certain variants of the F-35, particularly the Air Force variant, does have a gun. But from what I've seen, the Marine Corps and the Naval variants don't, which this is a Naval variant here, so it doesn't have a gun. However, it can take a gun pod. And that being said, I kind of feel that's a waste. You know, they can mount a gun pod on the pylon, on the center pylon. And it is integrated to the digital fire control system on the F-35, so I'll give them credit for that, even though it's a gun pod. But it's kind of like one of those things of, well, if you didn't need to waste that pylon for a gun, you could actually carry a fuel tank or whatever. Now there's other ways you can split it too, as well. If they don't have a gun, then they save weight. But, you know, once again, it kind of feels like to me that not having a gun on a fighter plane that could get into a dogfight could run into some issues. And that's because these issues have actually happened in the past. Let's talk really quick about the early F4s. And I want you to take a really close look there at the under the nose of the plane section. And you'll notice that there is no bulge under the plane. That's because these are early F4 Phantoms that did not have a gun on them. So the early production versions of the F-34 that served in Vietnam didn't have a gun, but they could take gun pods. However, those gun pods were not integrated. So essentially, well, as you can see here, a little sight shows up. Tells me where the gun's going to hit when I fire the M61 Vulcan gun. Well, it's actually an M61A1 Vulcan gun in the case of this F-22 Raptor. On the F4, it was, I think it was just an M61, although the gun pod had a different model number, but it was in general terms the same gun. But in general terms, it wasn't integrated, so there was no gunnery sight for it. You just kind of had to guess. You sprayed bullets everywhere and guessed. And I could be incorrect by this, but that's from what information I've seen about the gun pods for the F4. And that being said, the gun pods, they were not meant for dogfighting. They could be used for dogfighting, don't get me wrong. Realistically, in a pinch, you can try to use anything possible, even if it means, you know, throwing a frying pan at the enemy if necessary. Who knows? Real combat, it tends to be different from, you know, this is what it's meant for, but you know what? This is what we got, so this is what we're going to use type of deal. So even though the gun pods were meant more or less for strafing ground targets, yeah, I'm sure they would have used them in a pinch in a dogfight. Now, that being said, this caused a lot of problems. Now, part of it was because of the tactics the NVA were using with their MiG-21s. They essentially were using ambush-style tactics. They were flying very low, below the radar, and what they would do is they would try to ambush any F-4s that they found. Now, there's a lot of caveats to how they made this work, including using ground radar and things of that nature. But essentially, what they would do then is they would ambush any F-4s that were flying overhead. And the problem with that is when that happened, these MiG-21s would actually be at really close range. So close, in fact, the F-4s had troubles locking onto these MiG-21s with missiles. Now, there's another part of this too, is at long ranges, the F-4s actually did extremely well against those MiG-21s because, well, they actually could detect MiG-21s and lock onto the MiG-21s at a much further range. Now, there's another caveat that comes up, and I'm not quite sure what year this happened. But essentially, at one point, a F-4 Phantom had shot down a friendly F-4 Phantom that they had misidentified with radar. And because of that, the rules of engagement would change to whenever you detect an enemy plane by radar, you have to visually identify the plane. And this actually really put things in a bind for the F-4 Phantom, as it didn't have guns. And what that would do is that essentially would be a benefit to the MiGs, the MiG-21s, because these pilots had to identify these MiG-21s before they could engage them. And unfortunately, most of the time, being visual, that meant you were actually pretty much at gun range engagement zones. Now, the U.S. military had come up with a few ideas and concepts per se of how to do this type of dogfighting, but essentially what would end up happening is a lot of F-4s would end up getting shot down. They were actually losing, if I remember correctly, it was either 3 or 4 to 1. So they were losing a lot of F-4 Phantoms were actually getting shot down. Some F-4 Phantoms were actually not even engaging. If they essentially looked at the radar and saw that there was enemy planes in the area, they would get out of the area because they knew that they would be at a disadvantage, essentially. So what would end up happening is one, the creation of Top Gun, where they would essentially learn the very basics of dogfighting. But as part of this program for Top Gun, now this was the Navy solution, the Air Force came up with other solutions, but essentially the person that they had, like, kind of going, what's the problem, why are we losing so many planes? When he wrote his report, he indicated very heavily that we're losing planes because the F-4 Phantom doesn't have a gun. Essentially, it can't defend itself properly in close quarters dogfighting. And, well, of course, they would go, yeah, that seems pretty legitimate. And later, as you can see here, they would add a gun to the F-4 Phantom. That is actually the bulge under the nose. Now, I have seen it. I can't think of any of them. I have seen throughout history that there's been some other planes that didn't have guns already integrated in the planes. But then a lot of them also would be able to take a integrated pylon-mounted gun, Vulcan gun. So they still would have guns in some way or another. And that's kind of where my argument's going is that, like, yes, I know the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 seem like really high-tech, fifth-generation planes, and the need of a gun is, like, really no longer applicable because these planes are so high-tech. They're able to engage planes at further ranges. They're able to engage the planes more accurately. The missile systems are way better than they were ever before. But my argument is well, because of all that stuff, guns are going to sooner or later, in my opinion, become really important again. Now, this is my opinion, and I'm basing this off of the whole thing with Vietnam of you strip the guns off the planes, they won't have any way to defend themselves in close quarter dogfights. It's happened before, and if we essentially follow the same steps, it will happen again. Actually, a part of me is already concerned that we are following the same steps in the fact that essentially no one's shot an enemy plane down in like 20 years. So there's essentially a generation of fighter pilots that have not shot down planes. Actually, in fact, a lot of them have done nothing more but done high altitude bombing in something like an F-15 Strike Eagle, or even the F-22 can do bombing now, and obviously the F-35s can do bombing. Now, that being said, the Air Force, the Navy, all branches are still really stern on training dogfights, and they do a lot of mock dogfights, especially with guns. A lot of training is built and based around actually using the gun and not so much the missiles. Now, I'm not saying they don't train at all for the missile systems, but yeah, they still heavily want to train for using guns. So that's kind of one thing that's at least a benefit compared to the pilots of the Vietnam era, where they weren't really getting trained on the concepts of even doing that type of stuff at all. And that being said, I'm not saying the gun is the most useful thing. Actually, I think the gun is one of the most useless things on the plane. But that being said, even in Ace Combat, there is moments where I can get lined up and use the gun for kills. And, you know, it's nice to have it. And that's just the standpoint of Ace Combat. That's not real world. I imagine a pilot actually flying a plane, though, kind of thinks the same thing of, yeah, you know, it's not necessarily the most useful thing on the plane, but it's nice to have it. Now, my other part of the argument too is as these planes, you know, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35, even though they're the earliest of the 5th generation fighters, and that they're stealth capable fighters, ladies and gentlemen, the cat's out of the bag. There will be more and more and more stealth fighters to come. I mean, Russia's already unveiled their Su-35. The Chinese has the J-20 Mighty Dragon. So Japan also as well is working on a 5th generation fighter, and so is another country. And then there's a lot of countries that are buying planes like the F-35. So there's more and more countries getting these stealth fighters. And just as a theory, what I think is going to end up happening is because all these planes are coming out are stealth fighters, detecting enemy planes by radar might actually get harder, and it might get to the point where if you're going to find enemy planes, it's going to have to be done visually. So the need of a gun is still going to be really important, because even if you have a missile that can fire 20 miles away, you can't see that far away, and that's a known fact. Although the human eye can actually see quite far unaided, as a by the way. And even still, you know, who knows, there could be some kind of future countermeasure that would prevent planes from locking on. I know there's actually countermeasures for that now that will prevent planes from locking on to a target plane. I believe the F-16 has a mode or a system for that, like a jamming system that would prevent enemy missile guidance from locking on. But so, yeah, as time goes on, my argument is yeah, sure, you can save $10, $20, maybe even $30,000 on not putting a gun on planes like the F-22, but I think that's personally a cost-cutting measure that's going to sacrifice lives more than anything else, and is also going to put people at risk, and it's just obviously not worth it. It's not even, it even puts the plane at risk. You know, what's the point of having a multi-million-dollar plane when it's just going to be a target in a dogfight without a gun? So I argue that sooner or later, guns will be important again. But hey, whatever. You know what? Make guns great again. Anyway, folks, thank you all very much for tuning in. Hopefully you did enjoy this discussion and kind of hearing my opinion about guns, and maybe I swayed your opinion about guns, or maybe I didn't. I don't know. You know what? Comment down below. Tell me what you think. Do you think fighter jets still need guns? And did I sway your opinion? Did I not sway your opinion? Doesn't really matter. It's kind of open for debate, isn't it? Anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed this Ace Combat, Skies of Ace Combat video, and hopefully you'll tune in for the next one. Have yourself a wonderful day.